Well, hi, Ethan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lauren. It's so much fun to be here.
So, briefly introduce yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Ethan Bernstein. I'm a professor in the organizational behavior unit at the Harvard Business School, and I'm the author of Job Moves.
So, last year it felt really challenging. I would say maybe even a little scary to think about job moves and career development because it was a tough job market. How do you hope that your new book, Job Moves, will help people who are feeling stuck in their careers right now, especially if they were feeling like, oh, I don't have any choices. I'm stuck, but there also aren't a lot of choices out there to do something about it.
So, our book takes a page out of the new product development world. Bob Mesta, my co author, has invented over 3,500 different products with various partners around the world, including my personal favorite, that little arrow next to the gas tank gauge that tells you which side of the car the gas tank is on.
Oh,
So you drive to
yeah, that
the right
is
side of the
great.
gas station. So Bob brings with him this new product development lens, along with our silent fourth author, Clay Christensen, who was the person who brought us all together. He was my dissertation advisor. And in new product development, they have a theory called jobs be done. This idea being that we hire new products for a job to be done in our life. With the book, we borrow that notion to suggest that people hire their next job for a job to be done in their career. So we assume that organizations hire us, and that is indeed the case. But if we think about hiring the next role for the progress that we're trying to make, we think people will make more progress in their careers.
Well, that's a very unique take on it because I feel like I've been interviewing career experts for a very long time and no one has ever described it like that. So that is already off to a good start because I do think, to your point, in especially in job markets like this, you need a unique lens to be able to look through this and see it differently because it feels different. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions people have about navigating career transitions or even career, job moves, new career moves in general?
I'll start by saying, in part, we wrote this book because people do a lot of moves. So every year, roughly a billion people change jobs. On average, people do a job move roughly every 4 years. And we know that hundreds of millions of that billion report they're disappointed with the outcome from their switch. So it's frustrating, right? Because we spend so much effort. Sometimes we uproot our families, we change our lives, we try to change our trajectories for a move that seems to make sense. We get there and we discover it doesn't. Just the
Right.
same way Clay thought it was frustrating that talented people in great organizations would create new products and then only watch them fail because they hadn't understood that it wasn't about segmentation, it was about a job to be done. And it comes out for us in all audiences. When I ask an audience the fastest they've ever gone from taking a new job to realizing it's not right for them, usually as many as three quarters say less than a year.
Wow. I
So,
bet it's less than 6 months or something too. Like I feel like there's usually that gut initial reaction that then you fight off and then you come back to it.
and so part of the misconception, we think we're good at this because we get a lot of practice at it.
Yeah.
In part, I think one of the misconceptions that drives that is that finding the next role or even having a conversation about careers is about finding your dream job.
Yes.
And I'm not out here to say that you might not find your dream job, but most of us don't. Just like most of us are not on a linear path between our first job and our final. We're on
Right.
a zigzagging path because we're trying different things, we're figuring things out. The world changes, we change. It is a constant iteration process. And so a book like ours should not be about helping you find your dream job. It should be about helping people make great trade-offs. And so that's
Yeah.
misconception number one. We really try to form this as understanding what you might want and then making the right trade-offs for today, knowing that the trade-offs might be different in 2 years' time.
Right. And versus someone who is looking for a dream job, which is going to check every box for them. I, along with you, I do not believe in dream jobs. I think part of the myth of a dream job is what keeps people kind of perpetually unhappy and looking for something. It's the grass is always greener mentality, and then you never appreciate where you're at. I also agree a lot with you about where you are, a certain stage of life, certain trade-offs are more important. For example, I just went back into corporate. One of the trade-offs is like I absolutely love and have to be in a remote only workplace. But when I was 25, I would have hated that. And I'm just using that as like a really clear example of like physically where I worked was an important trade-off. I am curious too, So again, one of the key ideas in the book is the concept of jobs to be done. How does that framework apply to making career moves? Like, can you give us some examples of someone who's thinking about making their next move, how they might tangibly apply that concept to, okay, do I think about function? Do I think about company? Like, where do I start in that process?
Well, and as you know from talking to lots of people in this field, people talk about function, geography, industry. You can only change so many of the three, et cetera, et cetera. We come at this from a different perspective. We come at this from a perspective of, okay, so if there's no such thing as a dream job, there's only trade-offs.
Right.
Which trade-offs are you going to prioritize? And we actually, rather than thinking about it purely forward-looking, we started by interviewing over 1,000 people about their move, qualitatively, interviews, not surveys, to really understand the job be done they hired their next role to do. We took all of those interviews and we coded them and tried to distill them into the pushes and pulls, the things that pushed people away from their previous role and pulled them towards a new one. And I expected there would be, maybe this is my second misconception, I thought there would be hundreds of these. And actually, we brought it down to 14 pushes and 16 pulls, 30 pushes and pulls, 30 forces. But that still seemed like too many because that helps you maybe look at the menu and decide, well, what's operating for me, or rather, what's operating for the people around me if you're trying to help them. But that doesn't really get to your question of, okay, so how do you think about what really matters? What's the job be done here? What does that classify as? So we looked for patterns across those 30, and we found 4 sets of patterns, which we call quests. And they fall roughly, and you now are going to have to play with me here as I do a 2 by 2 in my mind, but
Okay.
along 2 dimensions. People generally either like the what of what they're asked to do, what capabilities they're asked to be using on a daily basis. I love being an actuarial, or I don't. Or rather, they don't. So they either want to build on what they've been doing, on the capabilities the organization has been asking them to use, or reset them. On the second dimension, you have the question of how your energy is driven. So perhaps you like the way the people, the environment, all the things, it just, you're in the vibe, you're in the mode, you're in the flow when you go to this work environment, or not. And so people are either looking to build upon the way in which their energy is driven and drained by the current role or reset it. For those who are trying to reset both, they're just trying to get out. That's quest
Right.
one. For those who are trying to build on both, they're take the next steppers. And the world is designed for take the next steppers. That's progression as offered to you by the organization you're part of. The off diagonals are a little more interesting. If you are, for example, in your case, enjoying the capabilities that are drawn upon, you like the what, but the how is not quite right. You find your energy drained more than driven because you don't want to commute to work anymore, or you need to be virtual for other reasons, or perhaps something in your life has changed. You're an empty nester. You want to be able to dial it up, or you have a new family. You want to dial it down a bit. You have a new manager who doesn't get you. All these pieces, that's the how. Now you're in regain control. And that's where, Lauren, I think I heard you say you were in your journey, where you need to be virtual. That's a how, not a what.
Right.
Others love the people they work with. They love the company. They feel the identity with the company. They love the work environment, every aspect of it. Maybe they love being hybrid or in person or virtual, whatever it might be. But it's the what. Somehow along the line, they got a reputation for being very good at doing something that they frankly don't want to do. It's not how they drive their interests. It's not how they drive respect. It's not how they want to be known. They're looking to regain alignment. And what's critical here, and perhaps this is a third misconception, we assume when we're giving advice to people that all advice is good career advice. You know better, having done many of these interviews.
Yes.
But the value of that 4 quest framework, and by the way, most of us will go through all 4 quests at one point in our life. Advice for one quest is not good advice for another. So if we
Right.
just give the same advice, 3/4 of the time, we're probably giving bad advice.
That I've never heard it said like that. And it's very good advice of you to say, almost like you need to qualify the advice you give to someone of like what quest you're on first, right?
And we only came to that because we really went deep into these 1,000+ interviews. So as my co-author Bob Mesta puts it, bitchin' ain't switching. So we very often talk about careers and career moves as things that we do in the future. when we take the time to think about them in the past, where the data is real as opposed to imaginary, we get real. And when we get real, we understand that every job move is not the same.
Interesting. How does a person, obviously they're not going through this, survey or interviewing situation that you guys were doing. How does someone figure out what quest they're on? And then what do they do? I'm sure obviously in the book there's a lot of different moves for each quest, but let's just start with like, how do you figure out what quest you're on?
So, our first step in our 9 step process is figuring out what quest you were on in your last move. So, you
Mm.
build muscle. And we take readers through the steps. It's more like an investigative journalistic interview. Like it's introspective in a way that is uncomfortable for some. And you can do it on
Yeah.
yourself, but we actually encourage this to be a social process. We believe another misconception about career moves is that they should be individual. A social process typically yields much better results. 11 out of the 13 chapters are written for the individual who's moving, but the other 2 are written for the organization and the mentor. And so our hope is that readers will take the first couple chapters of the book, the first step, read about it, hand the book over to a mentor who can read chapter 13, and then have that mentor conduct one of these interviews on them so that actually they don't need one of us. They've got somebody who's just as good or better because that person knows something about them already.
So essentially, once you figure out what quest you're on, which is one of the ways to determine that is also looking backwards and understand what was the quest you were on when you were doing maybe your last job move. And then that helps kind of inform whatever future moves you're making and how you're going to make those moves. Is that correct?
Step 1, past move. Steps 2 and 3 look at the energy drivers and drains and the capabilities that you want your organization to make use of. We have something called a professional balance sheet or career balance sheet that helps people think about capabilities, not just strengths and weaknesses. And then think about how that informs the next move and what quest you might be on going forward. Step 4.
I I also heard you on a different podcast talk about the story piece. A lot of times we're thinking about once we understand what our quest is, we have to come up with this pitch and we have to sell ourselves to the next employer. And I'm guilty of this too, create a resume that sells you. Why are you not a fan of the sell and pitch language? I know you emphasize more story, and can you kind of maybe give an example of that too?
There's definitely a role for selling in a career move. Obviously, the organization's trying to sell us and we're trying to sell them. The manifestation of that we are all familiar with. The organization sells us, in theory, with a job description or job posting that makes it sound like this job involves everything and requires everything.
Yeah.
Our favorite oftentimes is entry level job, 5 years worth of work experience required. These are so big now that doesn't make any sense. They're looking, it seems like, for unicorns.
Right.
And so our natural response is to take our resume, spruce it up, put everything we can possibly think of into it, and present ourselves as superheroes who can meet that unicorn requirement. That's not going to change. The problem is that that comes first. Then we really never know the answer to the question you asked earlier, which is how do I know what I want out of this move? How do I know what quest I'm on? How do I think about filtering this down to what it actually means for me? And so, in addition to so called the pitch, the elevator pitch, whatever it might be, we talk about a story spine. We borrow from Pixar's story spine approach to encourage people, once they've gone through the process of figuring out what quest they're on, what energy drivers and drains they have, what capabilities are they're searching for, all the pieces, that they then can tell the story of how they got to where they are in a Mad Lib like form and be able to do that just as effectively as they can sell the pitch. So they've got both. They've got the sell side, if you will, the pitch, but they also have the deeper version of it that will convince someone in a compelling way that this is indeed the right move for them.
Yeah. I remember again going through my process. I liked what I was doing, but I sort of needed to change where it was happening. And it almost became an easier story to sell because I had more of the puzzle pieces, right? I'm trying to figure out my own puzzle so then I can share and explain it to you. I'm mixing all these metaphors together. Hopefully this is not confusing for everybody, but I understand why it's very hard to sell something where you don't know the story behind it or the why or what, what made me drawn to this organization or this job function or whatever it is like that. And I think one of the hardest questions when I was a recruiter, one of the hardest questions for people always to answer when they were especially doing a career transition is, tell me about yourself or why are you interested in this role? So I feel like, you're solving a couple big key questions that will probably come up in an interview anyways. Um, okay,
Well,
I want to specifically, sorry, were you going to say something?
I was just going to come back to, I realize I keep coming back to your first question of misconception. So I'm going to add one more to the pile on that, just building on what you just said. The other almost impossible question for people to answer is, what do you want to do?
Yes.
And again, we borrow from new product development. You never say to a developer, what do you want to make? You ask, what do you think the 2 to 5 prototypes are of a product for this space, for this job to be done? It's much easier in careers as well for people to say, what are the 2 to 5 prototypes of what you might want to do next? And note that if you've got your quests and you develop different prototypes, prototypes that diverge from one another, so that later on convergence or the contrast and then ultimately convergence creates meaning for the individual. Now you have a story to tell because you've actually made some decisions about the trade-offs you're willing to make over time. And so part of it is also, I share your sympathy. I sympathize with you. I share your pain on the questions that they couldn't answer there. But I also wish we would stop asking people what's the one thing they want to do and instead ask them, what are the 3 to 5, 2 to 5 prototypes of what they might want to do so that we help them get closer to their story rather than just their pitch.
So what do you mean by prototype? Like give me an example. For example, I work in brand marketing, but the other careers I thought about were learning and development and talent brand. Are those prototypes kind of like those three different functions, or am I getting the concept of prototypes wrong?
It could be. It depends on what your search and what your move looks like. So for some people, it's even more narrow than that. So maybe they're in brand and they think about what a new role within their current organization might look like, what a new role with a competing organization might look like, what a role if they're owning part of the P&L for a brand, what it might be to instead be a consultant or an advisor to a brand, just enough variety such that they're staying within what they think is their space. But when they actually look at those different roles, they'll discover there's huge divergence between what their daily life would look like. So maybe what they're going to be is relatively similar, but what they're going to do is actually quite different. And then they can use that divergence to understand which of those best matches the energy drivers and drains they've seen in their past roles that would fuel what they think they want going forward, or vice versa. Maybe the energy is not the question, energy is all good, but which of those capabilities that they didn't want anymore to be drawing upon, now they could find the other ones they could. Each one of those slight variations helps us get closer to a specification and therefore to a story.
Interesting. I like it. I love when people kind of explain a process where I can visually kind of imagine, the step here, the step here, the step here. So I'm really into this. I want to, it's the new year. People are naturally thinking about their careers. People think about their career development, career potential. They'll say things like, I want to develop my career this year. I want to work on my career potential. If someone is sitting here and thinking that right now, what are 5 things or 5 tangible actions or moves that they could make to develop their career potential in 2025?
So the first is to recognize, I think, that if you go out there looking for what's available, you get overwhelmed. So don't do that. Not right away. First, develop your story as we've been talking about. The second, then, once you've got some sense of what you're looking for, that you're not looking for the dream job, but you have a sense of the trade-offs you're trying to aim to make. Now, start thinking about how it is that you could achieve that. What would have to change? What stays the same? And start to really narrow in on that. You're still only on, if we're the demand side in this one, it depends. If you're thinking about as individual movers, that's the demand side. If you think of demand side as being organizations, you're on the other side. It depends whether you're thinking of this as a manager or as an individual, whichever. Ignore the organization side still. be on the individual side. How is it that you could think about developing the capabilities or finding the energy drivers and drains that might help you along that path? And there's lots of ways to do that today that we didn't have before. You do a side gig. You can find a way to sort of slice your role a little bit more thinly and ask for a little bit of a different kind of responsibility. There's a lot of try before you buy that's available today that wasn't before. Once you've done that and you've gotten a better specification, then think about whether or not a move is actually imminent for you. We are all most of the time passively looking. The question is, are you willing to take the step towards active looking? And I'm not encouraging it. It's just a question you need to constantly be asking yourself. So I think I've gone through 3 out of 5 so far. Let me pause it. Am I making sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially we're all sort of passively looking, but versus actively looking. I have a friend who, she's open to a new job opportunity, but she doesn't want to sit down and actually apply for jobs. And I do feel like that is a threshold that you you really have to get on the other side of where, okay, now you actually are going to update your resume, look for things, apply. To your point, if you do that before this pre-work, it's going to be what we used to call in recruiting spray and pray, where you spray your resume everywhere and you pray that someone picks it up, and they will not. I always tell people they won't. And you will be so burnt out by the process because you'll be like, I'm applying, I'm not getting anything. So it's this self fulfilling prophecy. So I'm totally following what you're saying, and why the pre work is so important to this process.
And so then the fourth, I've got fourth and the fifth, and then I will promise to stop. But you gave me license for 5, so I'm
I
going to
know,
take you
I
up on
want
it.
them. Yeah.
So the fourth, by all estimations, we are not going to have as strong a job market in 2025 as we might have had in early 2024. That's frightening to some people because they're used to the idea of spray and pray, of the number of opportunities out there is directly proportional to how likely it is that I'll get one. The more specific you are and more compelling you are with your story and your process, the more likely it is that you're not competing with 1,000 people for one role, but rather with 3. Because you've actually specified who you are, why you make sense for this, and you might even be designing a role that doesn't exist yet, but when someone gets to know you and understands what you're looking for, they might even create that because they see the role for the way of doing that they wouldn't have otherwise. And then the fifth is notice everything I've just said gets better with social intervention.
Mm.
If we're not talking to the people around us about what it is that we're trying to do, specifically the kind of progress we're trying to make, the only thing they can offer us is progression. And progression is exactly what most of us have discovered. Yes, it always feels good. It always feels good to get more money. It always feels good to get a bigger title for about 5 days.
Right.
But we really actually want to make progress. And so if you're not bringing other people in to help you define what they think is progress for you, as you define what you think is progress for you and codifying that, then you're losing the opportunity to make traction even when you're a passive looker and not yet deciding to be active look. So I can give you an example of all of this.
Yeah, I was gonna just about to ask for that.
I could see it in your face. So
Yeah.
one of our stories in the book is, I always have to remember the pseudonym because I know that of course the real names of these individuals, is Alex. So Alex, 20 plus years in the same organization, senior executive. In this case, he loved it. He'd set up his life around the headquarters. His wife and kids lived there. His wife's family lived nearby. Everything was working for Alex until, as a result of several transactions and other circumstantial reasons, they decided they were going to move the headquarters. And he was senior enough that they told him his role would move with the headquarters. And you can imagine that was not a good night for Alex going home.
Right.
And they had the conversation and they just decided they couldn't move. He loved the company, he loved the role, and he couldn't keep it. So he went to work the next day and said, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take the package. And it was a generous package. It was 6 months. And he started a conversation with Bob, and he went through all of our steps with Bob. So much so he became one of our best students, frankly. Uh, he really, when it came time for him to socialize this, the fifth step, with somebody, and Bob suggested somebody at work, he chose his manager and went in and taught his manager the whole process he'd gone through. He did it, I think, better than I could. And he did it with the goal of asking the manager, does this sound like me? And the manager's first question was, well, what do you think? Alex, do you think this sounds like you? And he said, well, I think it sounds like me. And the manager said, well, if this sounds like you could do this virtually. Alex is still with the same organization. He's in this new role. As far as I know, he's thriving. And while one can scratch their head and say, why did the organization figure that out sooner? Well, it's because all these steps hadn't been in place. It hadn't been a social process. He hadn't spec'd it out as much as he could. The story wasn't there. He didn't really understand the trade-offs he was willing to make and not willing to make. He didn't have the prototypes there to help him figure out exactly where contrast could create meaning for him. All these pieces led to a situation in which it was about perfection, not progress. And all he really wanted to do was make progress.
Ah, that's so interesting. And I like that you're saying without the steps, we not, I think with good intentions, but accidentally focus on the perfection, not their progress piece. And progress oftentimes is, again, another misconception, is what you pointed out, is thought of as like a bigger job title, more money, something that you feel like is a box check. Because progress feels like this thing you can't see and touch other than the things you can see and touch, aka your job title on LinkedIn, your salary, that kind of stuff, right?
I once had a guest in my classroom at the Harvard Business School who's now a very senior leader in a top organization say titles give you a great return to ego, but that return doesn't last very long.
So true. I do think in the recent years people are starting to figure that out a little bit more, but it I have to say it's like it's still nice to sometimes have it to fall back on, and then you have to kind of gut check with yourself about it. I want one last question, which is what's the one piece of advice, or I'll allow you to pick more than one, 1 to 3 pieces of advice from job moves that you hope every reader takes away.
If I could fix if I could fix anything in the world right now, frankly, I'd fix job descriptions and the way the process works, especially because it's becoming increasingly evident that AI is making it worse, not better.
Right.
It's going to be my AI versus your AI. That's not creating better fits, better matches. What does create better matches? I mean, obviously, I would like to say all 9 steps, but if you make me choose just a few, one is to go through the real social process of understanding the pushes and pulls, understanding the forces, understand the causation so that you know what you're trying to hire your next job to do for you. In fact, full disclosure, we wanted to title the book Hire Your Next Job, but that didn't resonate enough with people because they didn't understand what that meant.
Right.
So my first wish is that everyone understands what that means. I'd love to take out of our language the idea of a dream job. I'd love to put into our language the idea that trade-offs can get you further along the zigzagging path towards your dream and make progress along the way so that progress is not perfection, or we're not
Yeah.
aiming for perfection. We're just aiming for progress. And then, frankly, I just wish people would stop asking people, well, what do you want to do?
Right.
Without a
Yeah.
common language, without any kind of support for that. We've said for 20 plus years in my field, leadership self-development, it's fantastic. People have the freedom and autonomy to figure out what they want to do and chart their own path and do it. And we've given people not enough advice for how. We've just
Right.
expected them to figure it out, and that's not fair. And so let's stop asking, what do you want to do? And start asking, what are the 3 to 5 prototypes of things you might want to do? And how do those compare with one another? And what inherent trade-offs and priorities do those expose for you? And then how can I try to ensure that within that framework, there's enough that we can collaborate so that you are rehiring my job, the one I have for you every day, in a way that makes it feel like you're making the progress you want to make, not just the progress the organization needs you to make.
Very well said. I especially love your advice about trade-offs can still mean progress. Oftentimes people see a U-turn or going in reverse as the wrong direction. And, sometimes you're reversing to go into a better parking spot or whatever, So I've really gone crazy with the metaphors here today, but I like that because I don't want people to get stuck on the visual linear line. To your point, the zigzag is most often the successful trajectory that people take. Often we've all seen the image online of what success looks like and what you think it looks like, and it's almost always curly and squiggly.
You know,
Um,
I was going to say, if you're walking through a maze, walking forward doesn't mean walking towards the end point.
right.
So a U-turn isn't necessarily turning around in terms of going reverse. Sometimes actually it's going forward. It just means you've turned your orientation around a little bit to make the next step of the maze work for you.
Yes. Okay, you said that much better than I did. I appreciate that. Ethan, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people learn more about you and follow your work? Obviously, your book is called Job Moves. I'll put that in the show notes. But where else can they keep up with you?
Well, let's start with jobmoves.com. We've actually made public a number of assets that we think will help people work through this process, including an assessment where you can plug in your pushes and pulls and see what the likelihood is that you're on one of the 4 quests. So we've tried to make this easy. And then if you want to learn more about me, just go to the HBS website, hbs.edu/ebernstein, and you'll see all the other work I do on workplaces and workplace trends.
Amazing. Thank you so much.